I'm going to call Carol Beaumont.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Oh, I don't even want to begin to try and do that. But I am rising, as my colleagues have, to speak in favour of what is in a very sensible piece of legislation. Its history is not so sensible, but what's in here makes sense. And this Land Transport and Road User Charges Legislation Amendment Bill makes amendments to both the Land Transport Act and the Road User Charge Act. And in doing so, what its primary purpose really is to enable regulations to be made exempting ruck vehicles from road user charges that are not required to be registered. And that is vehicles that are exempt from ruck make very little use of roads but make a sufficient contribution to the costs they impose on the road network through the vehicle licence fee. However, some vehicles are likely to impose higher costs on the road network than are covered by the standard licence fee, and that's the situation that this bill seeks to rectify. And there's been quite a lot of conversation about tractors and fast tractors, and that appears to be the main vehicle concerned in this situation. The bill also looks at offence provisions to breach of conditions associated with Section 40 of the Road User Charge Act. So it proposes to add offence provisions to support the enforcement of conditions associated with exemptions under Section 40. So that's all very interesting, and then there's 7 minor technical amendments to the Road User Charge Act to improve the operation of that. Now, that may sound quite boring, but as probably everybody in this House would agree, road user charges are important, and it is important that we get this right, which leads me to the very interesting history of this bill. And others have mentioned it, but I took the step of reading the first reading speeches, or at least some of them, on this bill, because I thought, gee, that's interesting what people are saying there, and what a fascinating history it is indeed. And it does show me, as a member of this House, the real value, I guess, of the Regulations Review Committee. Because what happened, in a nutshell, is that the original road user charge legislation actually didn't get it right. The government didn't get it right. And so then, and they didn't get it right a few times, really. And so I looked at Marion Street's speech, because she made a very interesting contribution in a first reading, talking about how delighted she was to see this piece of legislation come before the House, even under urgency, which, as other colleagues have mentioned, did seem a somewhat strange thing. But she was really delighted because she was the chair of the Regulations Review Committee and had seen all the toing and froing that took place around this particular, leading up to this bill. So basically, what happened was officials decided to try and fix up problems with earlier legislation by regulation. And the Ministry decided to introduce regulation pending outstanding policy decisions on how best to manage, that's a quote, how best to manage these exemptions. As she says, in other words, the government had not done it properly in the legislation. Now, what happened is, quite correctly, it was pointed out that the officials didn't have the power to do that. And so that was pointed out by the Regulations Review Committee. And it's very interesting that instead of trying to deal with it properly, the minister at the time, so it was disallowed, I believe that's the term, I'm just trying to find it again, disallowed, Charles Chauvel moved that. Instead of trying to get it right properly, the minister just had another go at trying to do it by some sort of backdoor means. And that's quite interesting. And the minister concerned was Jerry Brownlee. So it's actually, again, interesting. I want to quote Marion Street from her first reading speech. She said, "What happened after the disallowance of the regulation? The minister reinstated it. It was not any better the second time. It was not any better." So we have a complete litany of ineptitude, a complete litany of ineptitude. Now, that was the Minister, Jerry Brownlee. Now, I know, and I don't want to be unkind, but I am aware that if Christchurch colleagues were with me in this House right now, they would say that that sort of description of that minister is probably not too far of the mark. particularly in, oh, there is a Christchurch colleague here right behind me. Poto Williams is indeed confirming that in terms of the behaviour of that minister and the way that he has managed the situation in Christchurch, perhaps that same description, a complete litany of ineptitude, may well apply. But getting back to what happened with this bill and the regulations and so on leading up to where we are today, legislation was wrong in the first place, regulation was put in place that wasn't allowable, it was disallowed, then because there was no debate of that, further regulation that was disallowed, and then finally there was legislation introduced. And we have the Land Transport and Road User Charges Legislation Amendment Bill. So I think members throughout the House and anybody listening to this will find that quite interesting, and I don't know how common that sort of farce is, but I found it very interesting. Now, just going on to the detail really and why this is important, it is important that we have modernised and simplified road user charge system, which has appropriate provisions for compliance as well as appropriate monitoring mechanisms, and this bill seeks to do that. Now, also, government needs to ensure that the road user charges are fair and reflect the amount of time that the vehicle is actually on the road. And so this is where we talk about these high-speed tractors. And I notice in looking at first reading speeches, there appears to have been quite a lot of conversation between some members on different tractor brands. I don't intend to get into that, having no strong view on the matter. But it is, on a more serious note, Kiwis are being hit in the pocket by increasing petrol tax and increasing road user charges so that the government can pay for their gold-plated roads of national significance. And I think it's important as politicians that we think about transport infrastructure in a much more comprehensive and strategic way than this government appears to have been doing. What sort of transport system do we need in 20 years, 30 years, 50 years' time? And we do not believe that the roads of national significance will deliver on that. We need a much more strategic approach to transport direction. And in fact, it needs to be part of a strategic approach to economic development. And that's something we're not seeing from this government. And I do want to note, I thought it was interesting, the contribution from the MP Mike Sabin. When he was talking about roads and why we needed roads, he was talking about logs and milk. Well, yes, logs and milk are very important in our economy, but we need, yeah, that's true, and Judith Collins will certainly vouch for the milk part, but we do need to get past thinking about our economy as solely logs and milk. We need to be looking at the value add. We need to create a smart economy. We need a manufacturing base in this country, and this government fails to deal with those sorts of questions, fails to look at the role of government working in partnership with business, in partnership with unions, to develop a comprehensive economic development strategy for our country, where we can create really good quality jobs that deliver decent incomes to our people, instead of what is happening at the moment, where wage rates are an absolute disgrace. People cannot live on wages in many, many cases. The wages are simply insufficient to meet their costs, the family's costs, and that is just wrong. And that has not always been the case in this country. And some people maybe think that it has been. We have not always been a low-wage economy. We have, at times, in fact, had very similar wage levels to our Australian compatriots. But coming back to the bill, we do need a strategic approach in transport to ensure, and a strategic approach in the economy to ensure that we get those better wages. Now, local roads, a couple of people have talked about local roads, and I also would just like to comment that local roads are a critical part of our infrastructure as well, and are essential for regional development. But the other thing, and something that the government seems to have a lot of problem when they're focused solely on their roads of national significance, is the importance of our rail network. The rail network should be the backbone of our transport system, because we know that roads, the problem with roads is that they get full very quickly. All these roads, we build them, they're okay for a while, then they get full. What do? We build more roads. Well, we need to ensure that we have a rail network that actually can support our economy, including our manufacturing industry, Mr Speaker.
I call Simon O'Connor.
Speaker, I think this has been a great example, listening to the opposition of the